دوستان ضمن تشکر از آقای حاطف برای ارائه خوبشون. مهمان بعدی ما دکتر فیلیپ اسلون، استاد بازنشسته تاریخ و فلسفه علم از دانشگاه نوتردام در امریکا. خدمتتون عرض کنم که برای حالا من جالب بود که دیشب متوجه شدم که ما 2 تا از مقالات اخیر ایشون رو هم ترجمه کردیم اخیراً به فارسی. یکیش رو همین دوستمون آقای آرش رئیس برنامه ترجمه کرده، دیگه‌اش هم آقای گمینی ترجمه کرده. مقالاتی دارن در دانشنامه فلسفی استنفورد و اونجا در مورد تکامل، مفهوم تکامل پیش از داروین مقاله‌ای است که آقای گمینی ترجمه کرده و در مورد مفهوم تکامل در آثار داروین بین سال 1859 تا 1872 اگه اشتباه نکنم، بین 2 تا کتاب مهم داروین این تحولی که مفهوم تکامل نزد خود داروین داشته رو مقاله دارن که ما این مقالات مربوط به تکامل رو بنا داریم در 3 جلد چاپ کنیم و اون مقاله های دکتر اسلون هم، پروفسور اسلون هم در اون مجموعه خواهد آمد. Okay, Philip, we are ready. Are you ready?
Yeah, I think so. I've got possession. You can see me okay and everything?
Yes,
okay.
Everything is okay. Go ahead.
Well, good afternoon. I greet you from the University of Notre Dame in Indiana in the United States. And I first want to thank Reza Mirmar Sadehi and other organizers of this conference for the invitation to speak at this important symposium centered around the commemoration of Darwin's 212th birth date and a celebration of the forthcoming new translation into Persian of the first edition of The Origin of Species and also that of the Cambridge Companion to the Origin volume. I regret that I couldn't participate in the discussions of the papers that have been presented in Persian. These, I can see from my viewing, have been very substantial and scholarly and cover many dimensions of Darwin's work and significance. As scholars gain a deeper appreciation of how Darwin's work entered the discussions of non-Western as well as Western cultures, we understand more deeply how the reception has been shaped by pre-existent religious traditions, philosophical systems, social conditions, and colonial histories. These have formed a lens through which Darwin's work has been read and analyzed in complex ways. The full title of Darwin's book on the origin of species by means of natural selection contains what may seem to be a straightforward claim. Those natural entities of birds, fish, mammals, plants we designate and classify with proper names have arisen by the causation of something called natural selection as a historically acting cause. But as we explore this issue in more detail in light of Darwin's arguments, the issues become more difficult to interpret. And for this reason, there has been a long-standing controversy within the life sciences over what is a species in biology and what really has been Darwin's novel addition to this discussion. This issue may also have cross-cultural significance. Do other cultures carve up nature in the same way as the Western traditions, with their heritage of Aristotelian and scholastic logic and metaphysics? Do different pre-existent religious traditions and origin stories play an important role? As we look at the history of this discussion about species in Western conversations, on which I'm going to focus my attention, Darwin's revolutionary arguments for the transformation of species can be seen against the background of a long debate, a century-long debate over the nature of organic species. And I'm going to address this in the following 5 parts. First, the species question before 1850, Darwin's early reflections, going public, the tree of life, and then finally some conclusions on reading the origin through different cultural lenses. So the first part, the species question before 1850. I begin this reaching back into the middle of the 18th century that pitted against the 2 giants of this science against one another, the Swedish naturalist Carolus Linnaeus and the French natural philosopher Buffon. These two contemporaries, one a professor of medicine and botany and the rector of the University of Uppsala in the then powerful nation state of Sweden, and the other of the director of the King's Garden in Paris during the reigns of Louis XV and XVI, occupied commanding positions of influence that extended the reach of European natural history through colonization and exploratory voyages over the globe. Since he was the first to open this discussion, we can first look at the way in which Linnaeus conceptualized the meaning of species. Beginning with his Systema Naturae, published in its first edition as a series of broadside plates in Leiden in 1735, Linnaeus presented a massive classification of the known groups of plants, animals, and minerals in a systemization of these into a hierarchy of classes in the now familiar sequence of kingdom, class, order, genus, species, and variety. Within this new Linnaean hierarchy, only taxa next to the lowest category of this hierarchy were to be designated as species. Divisions below this, groups forming the Linnaean category of variety, were only accidental variations within the group, sharing a single form defined by a species definition. Now, I should emphasize there are no fundamental difficulties, except practical ones, in applying this same logic to the classification of both organic and inorganic entities, and Linnaeus himself classified minerals in the Systema Naturae by the same principles. The groups at the various levels can be interpreted as classes or sets that presumably, at least for Linnaeus, denote natural kinds, and in his view, entities resulting from divine creation. The lowest level of this classification hierarchy, the category, or the next to lowest, the category species, defines the specific form of the entities included in this. For example, Homo, as we see, with its final differentiation, sapiens, points to the substantial form shared by all human beings. In the following discussion, I'm going to denote this Linnaean taxonomic or logical conception of natural species as the taxonomic concept. It means a class or set of individual objects or organisms meeting defining criteria of species identity. This is the meaning of species that will pervade Linnaean-inspired classificatory works derived from his reform of classification. In some later texts directly relevant to Darwin's discussion, such groupings are termed book species to indicate their publication in works of classification. Now let's contrast this Linnaean view with the different way this issue was conceived in the work of Buffon, as put forth in his massive rival work in natural history, the Histoire naturelle générale et particulière, published in 14 volumes between 1749 and 1767, with supplements that with the work of his successors extended into the 19th century. Buffon's work was from the beginning different in kind, opening with discussions of historical cosmology, epistemology, and generation theory. It also included a substantial discussion of the varieties of the human species, but now in relation to geography. Buffon entered the discussions of natural history from an unusual background in mathematics, Newtonian physics, and French, German, and English philosophical discussions. From this complex background, he introduced his program as a direct rival to that of his Swedish contemporary, considering these issues in natural history in a more historical and comprehensive framework of discussion. It was in this context he also treated the question of classification and natural kinds. The novelty of Buffon's program in natural history involved a creative reinterpretation of the by then established Linnaean system and its fundamental concepts. First, his approach to the different animals was not in terms of classification, but rather in terms of life histories, habitat, material relations with other forms. This involved his explicit separation of two fundamental meanings of the term species available in the context of discussion at his time. One was the universal logical concept I have highlighted as the primary Linnaean meaning. The other designated the individualized substantial form shared by members included in this class, which makes these entities natural members of this class. This shared form is passed on, as traditionally conceived, from ancestor to descendant, primarily through reproduction. Now, in traditional Aristotelian and scholastic and neo-scholastic analyses, these two meanings of the term, the Greek term eidos, or species in Latin, were closely tied to one another. One, the universal in thought, the other, the substantial form in the individual. And by a process of abstraction, the form in the individual also became the universal in thought. And that's important to see. But what Buffon did was create an opposition between these two traditional meanings of species. Against the Linnaean concept, he emphasized only one of these, the perpetuation of form through reproduction, and proposed that what he called a real and physical meaning of species only applied to organisms was to be grounded on the material connectedness of individuals through reproduction, either contemporaneously or in time. We can see this clearly in his first, what is his first statement about species in the first volumes of the Natural History. Let's read here. However marvelous the individual appears to us, it isn't in the individual we find the greatest marvel. It's in the succession, in the renewal, and in the duration of species that nature appears almost inconceivable. This faculty of producing its likeness, which resides in animals and plants, this kind of enduring unity which appears eternal, this procreative power which is perpetually exercised, without ever being destroyed, is a mystery for us. And then we see here, and I've highlighted, this power of producing its likeness, this chain of successive existences of individuals constitutes the real existence of species. And as he elaborated this further in an important article in 1753 discussing whether the ass or the horse were members of the same species, he made this difference even more explicit as we read. It's neither the number nor collection of similar individuals which forms a species. In other words, it's not the Linnaean meaning at all. It is the constant succession and uninterrupted renewal of these individuals which comprises it. As Buffon developed this species concept in the course of these natural history, these physical and real species and material relationships of reproduction had both synchronic or horizontal aspects. Membership in such species was defined by relationships of interfertility, and also diachronic dimensions. The individual organisms constituting a physical species were connected in time by descent from a common source by physical reproductions. In both dimensions, organisms within a species are related by some kind of material continuity. To differentiate this from the Linnaean taxonomic species, I will designate the Buffonian species as historical species. Now, I can only sketch out very quickly the confusions in the literature created by this contrast in two different meanings of species in biological discourse that can be traced through natural history works up until the 1850s and beyond. Those particularly reflecting developments on Linnaean concepts continue to present species in the sense of a class or hierarchy in a hierarchy of nested classes. Those pursuing the Buffonian program developed a very different kind of discussion. In the German tradition particularly, reflecting developments in the German philosophy of nature of Kant, Herder, and Schelling, and powerful philosophical programs such as that of Hegel, we find an emphasis on the notion of historical species. In this reading, species were conceived as holistic and historical lineages constituted by reproductive relationships descending from a common ancestral source and extended in time and space. These species could also be subdivided by degrees of historical relationship, designated by such terms in German as Arten, Abarten, Unterarten, Rassen, and Gattungen. Now to come to the second part here, because with this brief introduction of history, we can now turn to Darwin's omnivorous readings in the 20-year period following his return to England in October 1836 from his 5-year voyage around the world on the HMS Beagle, described in more detail in the papers of Michael Roos and Robert Richards before. And the first sketching out of his theories in the small notebooks that cover this early period. Darwin had, since his days as a student in Edinburgh, been fascinated by the colonial invertebrates, bryozoans, sea fans, and he was deeply interested in these plant animals that seemed to bridge the two great kingdoms. During his Beagle voyage, he devoted extensive study to these forms, and in this diagram of one of these forms from his Beagle zoology notes, he illustrates the existence of separate feeding polyps in a colonial bryozoan that were connected, as we see, by an internal material core. In corals, which he also drew his attention and interest in these Beagle years, these feeding polyps no longer had a living connection, but only a connection of a dead skeleton that tied them together. Now, it's clear that metaphors drawn from his work on colonial invertebrates were before his mind when he first reflected on the species question in the Bee Notebook, opened in July of 1837. In the first quote from the Bee Notebook, we see how the model given by colonial invertebrates is being transferred now to a more general question, as we read, "The tree of life should perhaps be called the coral of life, base of branches dead so that passages cannot be seen." Then a few pages later, in his first sketch of a tree depicting this relationship, he writes, "I think between A and B, immense gap of relation, C and B, the finest gradation, B and D, the greater distinction, thus genera to be formed bearing relation to ancient types with several extinct forms." Now, commencing in 1845, following the completion of the 230-page rough draft, which Darwin sketched out on the primary argument of the future origin, which Robert Richards discussed yesterday, he undertook an intensive period of correspondence and discussion with his close confidant, the botanist Joseph Dalton Hooker, to whom he'd shown his 1844 manuscript. Now, as a botanist, Hooker referred Darwin to several sources dealing with the complexity of the species question as it was encountered in botany. These readings also took place shortly before Darwin began his extensive study of the barnacles in September of 1846. Primarily at that point, socialized as a zoologist and geologist, under Hooker's tutelage, Darwin became immediately engaged with the problems of botanical classification, issues that he would then confront in a similar form in the zoological world in his massive study of the barnacles. This sequence of mid-1840s readings can be followed in his reading notebooks and annotations on key texts. In these readings, we can follow the interplay that develops between the taxonomic or Linnaean and the historical or Buffonian species concept I've outlined above. What I argue is that Darwin then drew into creative but somewhat confusing synthesis the species concepts from these two separable domains of discourse. We can follow this synthesis into the Big Species book, also called the Natural Selection Manuscript, which was the work from which Darwin published, which the published origin would be quickly condensed in 1858 and 59. This long and incomplete manuscript opens its fourth and eventually the second chapter of the published origin with a commentary on the confusion over the various definitions of species found in the literature. As he opens it, "In this chapter, we have to discuss the variability of species in a state of nature. The first and obvious thing to do would be to give a clear and simple definition as what is meant by a species. But this has been found hopelessly difficult by naturalists, if we may judge by scarcely the two having given the same name, we might say." And a little further on, he seems to then embrace this Linnaean taxonomic meaning of species. In the following pages, I mean by species those collections of individuals which have commonly been so designated by naturalists. There's often a wide neutral territory in which the terms species and varieties are bandied about according to the state of our knowledge and ideas of the term species. But from the earliest jottings of the Bee Notebook onward, we have seen how Darwin had been interested in the notion of relations of common descent. This was reinforced by his careful readings of German works on botany that emplaced what I have called the Buffonian historical meaning of species. This is the concept that becomes the basis of his own species definition, then offered in the long manuscript, as we read here. Hence, I conclude that descent is a prominent idea under the word species as commonly accepted. The idea of descent inevitably leads the mind to the first parent and consequently to its first appearance or creation. Now, referring back to these earlier manuscript sources enables us to unpack several otherwise puzzling issues in later discussions of species, and particularly the fluidity in his concept of variety. Variation blurs the boundaries of species and varieties, or species and genera in practical taxonomy, and introduces the need for expert skill and consensus among competent authorities as the only means of deciding these limits. But now Darwin reinterprets these difficulties by appealing to what we have called the Buffonian historical species concept. This underlies the conceptual fluidity of Darwin's discussions that we can follow directly into the published Origin. So to the third part, we can turn to the Origin itself. Presented initially as an abstract of his intended book, the published Origin involved a drastic stripping out of the detailed references and supporting materials from the big species manuscript. This created a condensed and ultimately more popularly accessible form of presentation. Arguments developed in the long manuscript with reference to specific groups of organisms were rendered universal claims by this condensation. This also meant that the supporting documentation and detailed references to sources were typically not present. This was both its strength and its weakness. The work of Darwin originally planned to publish would likely have been in 2 volumes and similar to the later variation of plants and animals under domestication, with footnotes, tables of data, diagrams, and references. As such, it would have been read primarily by a scientific audience. But what appeared was something very different, an abstract of a book that would actually never be written. In this form, lacking footnotes, tables of data, and technical scientific language, it was accessible to a broader reading public that had no particular expertise in these subjects, but who might have read the popular Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation that appeared anonymously in 1844, a text that would in fact go through more editions and sell more copies in England than the Origin itself. On the issue of species, this condensed form of presentation in the published Origin submerged the important details in the genesis of his novel views we have examined up to this point that Robert Richards also referred to yesterday. Instead, we find a compressed discussion that is difficult to clarify. To understand Darwin's arguments, I've examined the various usages of the 1,488 occurrences of the term species in the first edition of the Origin. This review of word usage displays the complexity of Darwin's argument. It presents no single view, but instead an interweaving of several diverse meanings. Judging from these usages alone, it's difficult to find a systematic presentation. In several places, Darwin's usage is consistent with the Linnaean taxonomic concept we discussed, meaning a class of set of objects sharing certain defining properties. And as we see in this quote, the differences in the judgment of naturalists in making these distinctions. But in other places, it's the meaning of species and varieties as historical and genealogical lineages, displaying varying degrees of historical relationship which predominate. He speaks in such contexts, often interchangeably, of subspecies, races, and varieties, recalling his discussions in the Big Species Notebook. And we can see here, the dominant species are the most diffused in their own country, and the most numerous in individuals which often produce well-marked varieties, or as I consider them, incipient species. We'll come back to that term, incipient, briefly in a minute. For example, Darwin introduces his analysis. What is remarkable in the second chapter of the Origin is how he introduces his analysis first with a description of the traditional practical problems created by individual variations in defining characters that face any naturalist working on preserved specimens. This was a problem he clearly struggled with in his work on the barnacles. But remarkable in this discussion, and a claim that was startling to some of Darwin's readers and critics, is that this practical problem, facing what I've termed taxonomic species concept, is interfaced without detailed argument with gradation in degrees of genealogical relationship at issue in the Buffonian historical meaning. Consider the following passage from chapter 2. Certainly no line of clear demarcation has been drawn between species and subspecies. That is, the forms in which the opinion of some naturalists come very near to, but do not quite arrive at the rank of species. Or again, between subspecies and well-marked varieties, or between lesser varieties and individual differences. These differences blend into each other in an insensible series, and a series impresses the mind with the idea of an actual passage. Now, this claim could still be understood as a difficulty presented by taxonomic analysis at the taxonomic species level. But these taxonomic difficulties in classification are now seen as evidence for degrees of historical descent in the conception of species as material historical lineages. Hence, I look at individual differences, though of small interest to the systematist, as of high importance for us as being the first step towards such varieties as are barely thought worth recording in works of natural history. And I look at varieties which are in any degree more distinct and permanent as steps leading to more strongly marked and more permanent varieties, and these latters as leading to subspecies and to species. And I attribute the passage of a variety from a state in which it differs very slightly from its parent to one in which it differs more to the action of natural selection in accumulating differences in structure in certain definite directions. Hence, I believe a well-marked variety may justly be called an incipient species, By combining these two strands of species discourse into one, Darwin created an unusual conceptual synthesis with revolutionary consequences. At least two primary results can be seen to follow. First, he drew novel conclusions on the meaning of uncertainties created by individual variation of practical taxonomy. Second, prior discussions of the historical or Buffonian concept of species had interpreted the historical relations to hold within, to be confined within the limits imposed by an originating form, a mold, or an archetype that maintained a historical unity within a common stem, even if this unity allowed some wide divergences in response to environment. But we see that for Darwin, the difficulties raised by practical taxonomic species problems tied to species and variety determinations are employed to undermine the claims for historical unity of groups within a common stem central to the historical species discussions. Such species no longer maintain a conservative unity of type. So we come to the fourth part here, species and the tree of life. In the arguments of the crucial chapter 4 of the Origin, Darwin introduced his principal divergence and illustrated this with a single branching diagram to illustrate how natural selection worked over time. Now, it's remarkable to see how this diagram functions within the framework of issues set out above. The diagram is initially introduced as representing no more than relations of individuals within a species of a single genus forming lesser races or varieties. It could also be interpreted as a claim about relationships between subgroups within a single species. As we have seen, Darwin saw that distinctions between these are often difficult to make because of problems presented by character variation. But the difficulty in blurring of distinctions between taxa that make it difficult to separate varieties and species because of overlaps in slight variations is then summoned by Darwin as support for more general argument about the blurring of historical relations of higher groups. As one quickly perceives from a few pithy pages of argument that follow, the coordinates of this diagram are purely relative. The horizontal lines representing time periods can represent 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 or millions of generations or even geological ages. Similarly, the degrees of divergence illustrated by the diagram can represent the relations of varieties within species, species within genera, genera within families, or any other degree of relationship designated by category names applied in a genealogical sense. These relationships are now historical rather than horizontal or static relations of classes. And as Darwin summarizes his point, as buds give rise by growth through fresh buds, and these, if vigorous, branch out and overtop on all sides many a feebler branch, so by generation I believe it has been with the great tree of life, which fills with its dead and broken branches the crust of the earth and covers its surface with its ever-branching and beautiful ramifications. Now to my conclusion. In this talk, it's been my intent to highlight some complex background between the title of Darwin's book and indicate where I see creative dimensions in his discussion. I want to highlight these following. First of all, we see the ambiguities presented by natural forms in distinguishing varieties, races, and subspecies create difficulties in practical taxonomic work that make these distinctions somewhat arbitrary. Second, this ambiguity is now interpreted as evidence for historical and genealogical relations. Varieties are incipient species. This combines Linnaean and Buffonian discourses. This difficulty at the variety-species boundary can then be generalized by the relativizing of historical time relations and degree of taxonomic divergence. And finally, the micro-tree of historical divergence of varieties can be generalized as a macro-tree relating all life in geological time. The underlying complexities in these arguments I've developed in this lecture were in many ways lost in the condensed presentation of these arguments in the published Origin. Some readers, such as Louis Agassiz, could only see Darwin as denying the existence of species. Others, such as Richard Owen, saw him making an illegitimate leap from taxonomic distinction to historical relations. Many German biologists, by contrast, read the Origin through the lens of Hegel's and Schelling's philosophy of nature, and emphasized how instead species could now be seen in Darwinian terms as holistic and historical entities that can now be seen to change in time without limits, a concept I suggest can be traced into contemporary biology through the writings of Ernst Mayr. I see this heritage to lie in the background of those theorists advocating today an individualist rather than class or set conception of species. But how these discussions were read outside of European Anglophone cultures illustrates the flexibility of Darwin's argument and the different background conditions into which the text was introduced. As Mr. Mohammed Massoumi has developed in his paper on Saturday, and I thank Reza and Mr. Massoumi for this information, the previous Persian translations had a complex history that run through translations in 1939, 1972, and finally in 1978. How these translations interpreted these texts, I have emphasized, I don't know. But as shown in the important research of my doctoral student, Dr. Xiaoxing Jin, represented by his recent ISIS article, as Darwin's ideas merged further east into China, it went through complex stages. Darwinism first entered Chinese discussions through discussions not of Darwin's works, but of the evolution and ethics essay of Thomas Henry Huxley of 1893. This appeared in translation with commentary in 1898 as the popular Tianyan Lun, or Natural Evolution, by the British-trained naval engineer Yan Fu. This shaped the popular understanding of evolutionary theory in China in profound ways for much of the 20th century. The Chinese translation of the Origin itself, however, only began in 1902 with the work of the chemist and poet Ma Jianwu, leading to the publication installments of the first 5 chapters in the historical sketch between 1902 and 1906. The first full translation of the 6th edition into Chinese by Ma Jianwu was only made in 1920. But as Jin's work has shown, the way in which these texts were rendered in translation blurred many of the distinctions made in Western readings of Darwin. First, it was fit into a strongly Lamarckian progressive evolutionary framework. Second, Ma Jianwu conflated many important concepts. The taxonomic category of variety, for example, was confused with the concept of individual variation. His language of perfect adaptation, strongly present in the first edition of the Origin and highlighted yesterday in Robert Richards' paper, was interpreted in relation to the Taoist concept of the yin and yang. Natural selection was read as a great superior selecting principle, but not a deistic agent that forces species to progress. The diagram in Chapter 4 we have examined is interpreted as a picture displaying natural kinds that could or not successfully progress. So some of these issues were rendered differently and more faithfully in the translation that Ma Jianmu made of the full origin of the 6th edition in 1919. But these examples show us how complex has been the history of Darwin's text and highlight the different ways in which the origin of species can and has been read through many different kinds of spectacles. How the cross-cultural translations into Persian have rendered and interpreted Darwin's concept specifically on the meaning of species and the issues I've outlined in this talk, I must leave to your further research. And I thank you for this opportunity to speak to you today. Thank you.